Everyone, welcome to another comics and cartooning loving edition of Words, Images, and Worlds. On this episode, I am delighted to be talking with artist and creator Pat Lewis. Pat, thank you for joining.
All right. Hi. Thanks for having me.
Pleasure, absolutely. John Patrick Green has been on before a couple of times, so glad to be talking to you about your work with him, your other works as well. And I'm curious what led you into comics and cartooning and this world of creating that you're in.
Well, it's kind of a long story, I guess. Do you have time?
I
Uh,
do, I do. I have time.
all right. Well, when I was a kid, I didn't really see my parents read for fun very much, but they did both read the newspaper every day. And so it just was very natural and normal for me to also read the comic section of the newspaper. And, we could talk about what we read. And so I was always very into that, into newspaper comics. We had some Peanuts reprint books around the house, and that was what I always thought I was going to do for a living was draw a comic strip. And so, as I got older, certainly I was into other things. I was into Mad Magazine. I probably had some Harvey comics, Richie Riches and stuff around the house. But really
Mhm.
newspaper comics were always kind of my main interest. And as I got older, I tried my hand at drawing some of those. I drew just a lot of just random stuff for fun, but I didn't really turn a lot of these drawings into comics until I started getting older.
Mhm.
So as I got into high school, I once in a while draw something, maybe a comic about a teacher or something, but I wasn't really serious about it until I got to college. At college, I went to Penn State, and I was an English major, but my real reason for choosing Penn State University was because it was so big and the newspaper had such a big circulation there that I thought, well, if I can draw comics for the paper, I'll have this huge audience. So I asked them if I could draw a comic strip for the paper, and they actually said no. They had never, that was not something they did. They had editorial cartoonists who were students, but the only comics they ran were, a handful of just regular syndicated strips like Peanuts and stuff. So I drew editorial cartoons there for a couple years, and then my senior year, the town newspaper, the Center Daily Times from State College, decided to put out a student-focused publication to kind of compete with Penn State's Daily Collegian,
Mhm.
and they wanted actual comic strips, and so they let me draw a comic strip there, and I got paid very little to do it, but I got paid something at least for a college student. That was pretty exciting. And so I drew a comic strip for that. It was called The World's Smartest Baby. And it was about a baby who went to college and he had kind of this 90s slacker roommate and they got into wacky adventures and stuff. And it was
It's
it was
nice.
super fun. I really liked it. And I think the thing I liked the most about drawing a comic strip like that was I liked that it was sort of character focused. Um, and as you read a strip, if you read it every day or for weeks and months and years, you really get to know those characters and identify with them. And I really liked, especially, I didn't realize this at the time, but I liked when a comic strip would kind of do a continuing story, like if Calvin and Hobbes, Calvin would be Tracer Bullet, Private Eye for like a week. And I always thought those ones were really cool. And I didn't realize, but I think I liked sort of more of the extended narrative. But I never really saw anything in like comic book form that was telling sort of the kind of stories that I liked. It was all just superheroes or stuff for little kids, and I just wasn't really interested in those things. So I took this comic strip that I was drawing, The World's Smartest Baby, and I submitted that to syndicates, and I got a bunch of rejections, but they were at least personalized rejections, and they really encouraged me to keep trying. And I mean, this was all I wanted to do. So as I finished my senior year and as I graduated, I just kind of made submitting comic strips my job. So I submitted these. I would just work up a submission package, send it out, and as soon as it was out the door, I would just start working on the next one. Um, and I did that for a few years, and I kind of noticed as this was going on, this is sort of the late 90s, early 2000s. Kind of every time I would send one out, there was like one less syndicate to send it to, because this
Mm,
is around the time where the internet was just killing newspaper readership, and the syndicates couldn't really survive. So I did that for a while, and then finally I had one strip that I submitted that was pretty successful. A syndicate actually signed me to a development contract. And, part of what that meant was that they paid me a salary basically to just draw this comic strip for a couple months. And the idea was
mhm,
to see if I could do it consistently and maintain the quality and work with their editors. And I did that. And when it came time for the contract ended and it came time for them to make the decision whether or not to syndicate me. And I think really it was, at this point they'd spent a fair amount of money on me. I think they were planning on it. But at that time, the syndicate had just merged with another one, and they were already contracted to launch another strip. So they kind of got kicked down the road a little bit, kicked down the road a little more, and then eventually they said, I don't think this is going to happen." And
mm,
so I was really just devastated because, like I said, that was what I thought I was going to do for a job for my life, um, to just draw a comic strip every day and get up in the morning, draw the strip, and that would be my like just a career. And I was devastated. I was really hurt, but I tried a couple more times. But by this point, I was living on my own, and I needed to make money. So I kind of thought, well, maybe this isn't going to happen. Maybe I'm not gonna draw a comic strip. Maybe that's not a realistic career goal anymore. So I kind of quit that, and I started edging into illustration. And I
mm,
started doing a lot of
mhm,
book illustration, magazine illustration, mostly newspapers. But while I was doing that, I also started to learn about other people, both here in Pittsburgh and sort of all over the country that were making their own comics. Sort of this indie comic movement, I think, was kind of gaining some traction and gaining some steam. So like the local alternative news weekly here, the Pittsburgh City paper ran an article about a young woman in Pittsburgh who was making her own comics and selling them. And so I got in touch with her and I got some of her comics. I thought I could totally do this. And I found out about the local like independent comic shop that didn't sell superhero comics. They sold these underground comics. And it just really opened my eyes to this sort of potential for telling these longer form stories, and they could really be anything. They didn't have to just be the superheroes or the, you know, Alf comic or Richie Rich or anything like that. And so I started making some of my own. The first one I made was just a collection of some of the old comic strips that I'd submitted just so I could show my friends what I'd been working on. But then I liked that format and I started writing longer stories and drawing longer stories. And I started going to conventions around town, and I went to Space in Columbus and the Small Press Expo in Maryland and MoCA in New York, and I met a lot of other people who were doing the same thing, and it was just really huge for me, and I kept doing that for many years. But then I guess eventually, kind of the illustration side I was becoming more successful as an illustrator, and I didn't really have as much time to make these comics. So I just kind of focused on that for many years. And I did illustrations for just anybody who would hire me. And eventually I kind of had the idea that I was going to narrow my focus a little bit. And I really like drawing funny animals and stuff for kids. And I think that's where the market is for me. So I really narrowed my focus to that. And I started working for Highlights magazine and drawing hidden pictures and puzzles and cartoons and all kinds of stuff for them for quite a while. And then that led to some book illustration for projects for kids. And then eventually those book illustration projects for kids turned into comics for kids that I started getting hired to do.
It's nice. Quite a journey, and it sounds like you found your way in the industry, and certainly through times where media was changing a lot too.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. It was like it's hard to even remember as a kid, growing up in the 80s, 90s, you couldn't find anything that was sort of outside of the norm. And
Hmm.
then there was just that real explosion of it, kind of in the early 2000s, I think. The library started having a graphic novel section, so I could just go and read kind of anything that looked interesting to me, and it really expanded my knowledge base at the time.
Yeah, yeah. You've been solo artists on projects. You've also been part of a collaborative team on books like Investigators. I was going to ask about what it was like to work in that series and what it was like to work with John Patrick Green and kind of put your mark into that area as well.
Yeah, so to be clear, Investigators is all John Patrick Green, and Agents
Hmm.
of S.U.I.T
Hmm.
is the spin-off series. So I was contacted. I knew John sort of from those days selling comics at conventions. So he recommended me when it came time to do this spin-off series. He recommended me along with I think a handful of other artists, and we all did a tryout page, and I wound up getting the job. And I think it
Nice.
has been a real learning experience for all of us. Everybody had to like let go a little bit. Like I think if John, I don't want to speak for him, but I think he's probably fairly protective of these characters.
Hmm.
It's certainly his name is on the book. It's the biggest one, so he wanted to make sure everything was good, and he had to kind of trust me to handle his kids. And this is the first time really that I've drawn comics that I didn't color myself. So we handed off to a colorist named Wes Joba, and I have to kind of trust that he'll also do a good job. Sometimes we'll get the pages back, and I'll think, oh, I didn't imagine it that color, but is it a big deal? It's not. So I think it's been a real experience for all of us to do that. But the nice thing about working with John is because he's a cartoonist also, I get feedback on my rough pages in a way that I've never gotten before. Usually when I hand stuff off to an art director and editor, they're probably not a cartoonist, and they'll have maybe kind of superficial comments. Oh, like, can you make this person a different race or something? But, with John, we get into really talking about the language of comics, and there's some sort of tools that he uses that I wasn't accustomed to using, and I probably use some tools that he doesn't. Like, for example, one thing he likes to do when he's drawing the characters in a panel is he'll make them as big as they can possibly be to fit in the panel. And that might mean that their heads overlap the dialogue balloon. And that was just never a thing that I had done before. It never really occurred to me. And there were many times when we first started out that he would say, you could make that character a little bit bigger and just put their head in front of the balloon instead of behind it. So that way they don't get cropped off at the top. And it's been really neat just to sort of have somebody that I can talk about that kind of comics minutia with.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, very cool. Very cool. I love the creative community as well. And you're mentioning kind of getting to know him through being part of that community, which I found to be a very welcoming space.
No, for sure. Yeah.
I was also going to ask about science comics and your work there. I've used those in the classroom, so I have a special place for those, as well as any other positive experiences in the career path so far that you'd like to mention for listeners.
I mean, I think the really neat thing about, Science Comics is a series, just for anybody who hasn't seen it. There's a science comics book about just about anything you can imagine, skyscrapers, cars, any kind of animal out there. And I was contacted to do Science Comics Wales. And actually the editor on that was another cartoonist that I had known from our days making and selling comics, Dave Roman. And they approached me with this book. And I don't know, or at the time at least, I didn't know anything about whales. It was written
Mm,
by Casey Zakroff, who I think is a marine biologist. And so he had, this whole script written, and it was just kind of a crash course for me in whales and everything. I had to look up pretty much every panel. I had to research what I was drawing But fortunately, Casey, even though that was his first comic that he had written, I believe he's a big reader of comics. So he had a lot of visual ideas and he would suggest sort of ways to convey the information. Sometimes it was too much and I had to kind of rein it in a little bit. But it was a real crash course in just sort of figuring out how do how do you fit all this stuff into a page and how cartoony can it be if I need to draw, a whale's nervous system or something. It has to be fairly accurate, but also has to be in my style. So there was a real learning curve to adapting that, and I think it turned out pretty good.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm curious about your process and also any influences that you have. You've mentioned some comic strip influences, it sounds like. So anything that's kind of blended into your style.
I mean, probably the biggest one would be Bill Watterson, Calvin and Hobbes. Um,
Hmm. Hmm.
that kind of ran from that. I think that started in the paper when I was about 10, and then it ended when I was like 20, which I think is just about the perfect stretch of your life to grow up reading Calvin and Hobbes. So I really internalized a lot of that. Um, I really like drawing characters, and I like using sort of the characters like facial expressions and body language to really convey what's going on, the emotions that are happening in the comic. And certainly that's something that you saw a lot in Calvin and Hobbes,
Hmm.
kind of
Hmm.
exaggerated expressions when it's called for. I probably get a lot of that also from, animation. I was always a big fan of, Hanna-Barbera, Flintstones, Yogi Bear, any Chuck Jones cartoon. Just sort of all that, the way that they could use drawings to really convey what was going on inside a character's head. Uh, that was always really impressive, and that's kind of something I really strive for too.
Nice, nice. What's next in the creative path?
Well, let's see. So the next Agents of Suit book is the fourth one in the series. That's called So Much Trouble. That is coming out February 17th. Um, I've already drawn the fifth book, so that's done. That'll be out
Wow.
in February of 2027, most likely. And in a couple months, I'll start work on the next. That'll be the sixth book, seventh book. Now I'm losing
Cool.
track. Anyway, I'll start work on the next Agents of Suit book shortly. Yeah, shortly after that. In the meantime, I'm working on a few of my own projects, trying to get some strips or some scripts finished so that I can start pitching books of my own. But yeah, anybody who's interested in finding out more, my website is Pat N. Lewis. That's N as in North, .com. And all my social media links are on there. Mostly I'm active on Instagram and Blue Sky, and I use the name Pat N. Lewis on both of those.
Fantastic. Well, many thanks, Pat. Glad to have you back anytime. And probably the next time we chat, you'll have a few more books under your belt. I have no doubt.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much.